Hello, welcome to Cosmic Chemistry, presented by City Bible Forum. Tonight we're here to ask the question, do science and God mix? And we're privileged to have with us two scientists to explore this topic. Dr. Carmen Lawrence is Winthrop Professor of Psychology at the University of Western Australia, and Dr. John Lennox is Professor of Mathematics at Oxford University. Tonight, John will address this question, do science and God mix? Then Carmen will interview him, and then it's over to you for your questions. Carmen will put your questions to John. You can submit your questions either by mobile phone or using the hashtag CosChem. Now, you might like to take this moment as a prompt to make sure that your mobile phones are switched to silent. But you might also like to take this moment to note down either that hashtag, CosChem, or the mobile number on the screen. You, of course, can send through your questions at any time from now. Before I introduce our moderator, I'd like to thank our event partners, National Science Week, Coorong, Sunshine FM, and West TV. Professor Lawrence served as Premier of Western Australia from 1990 to 1993. She then moved to Federal Parliament, where she held a number of portfolios. Upon retiring from politics in 2007, Carmen accepted a position at the University of Western Australia, where her brief was to study the origins of extremist behaviour and fanaticism. In recent years, she's taught in the psychology department and has been part of research into belief formation. Carmen has described herself as a non-believer, and we're delighted to have her involved in tonight's event. Please join with me in welcoming Professor Carmen Lawrence.
Thank you very much indeed. You won't hear very much from me apart from the questions, and I hope that I'll ask questions that will interest you, and then we'll move quickly to question and answer. But my great privilege is to introduce Professor John Lennox. Many of you will know a great deal about him, and you've probably seen some of his lectures on YouTube and other places, or read texts, or even his books if you're lucky enough. John Lennox is a Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford, and I understand there are some mathematicians here with us this evening. He's also a Fellow in Mathematics and Philosophy of Science and a Pastoral Advisor at Green Templeton College at Oxford. He teaches for the Oxford Strategic Leadership Program at the Executive Education Centre in the Said Business School, also at Oxford. John has travelled extensively, including in former communist Europe and Asia, and as a result is able to converse in numerous languages. As you know, he's written many titles on the interface between science, philosophy, and theology, which is why he's with us tonight, including God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God?, and God and Stephen Hawking, A Response to the Grand Design, as well as 70 published mathematical papers and other academic texts. As you would know, John has had public conversations with Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Peter Singer, Michael Shermer and Lawrence Krauss at events such as this all around the globe. Please welcome Professor John Lennox, who will speak to us on cosmic chemistry, do science and God mix?
Ladies and gentlemen, you do us great honour in attending this evening. And I'm very touched to have such a distinguished moderator. I confess to never having been publicly interviewed by a premier before, let alone a professor of psychology who has studied fanaticism. And coming from Northern Ireland, I begin to tremble slightly. Nevertheless, we're to address the question, do science and God mix? They obviously do. For some people, they don't for others. There is a very widespread impression that science has made faith in God both unnecessary and false. But it cannot be so simple as that, because Last year's Nobel Prize for Physics, for instance, was won by Peter Higgs, a Scotsman who is an atheist. And a few years before that, the same Nobel Prize for Physics was won by Bill Phillips, a Christian. What separates them is clearly not their science. They both reached the top of the tree in physics. What separates them is their worldview. One is a Christian, a theist, and the other an atheist. And I'd like to suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that we can only understand this conflict. It is a conflict, but it is not, I would want to submit to you tonight, between science and God. It is rather between two worldviews, the worldview of atheism and the worldview of theism. And so the main question, I think, to be addressed is, in which direction does science point? Does it, as Richard Dawkins suggests very strongly, point towards atheism? Or does it, as I would wish to suggest equally strongly, point towards theism? And what I wish to do is to give you several of the major considerations that influence my thinking, looking forward to the questions that you will inevitably ask. Of course, being a mathematician, I must make clear at the outset that we're not talking about proof in the mathematical sense. You only get that in mathematics. We're talking about evidence, argument, inference to the best explanation, and so on. That does not, of course, mean that we cannot achieve any degree of certainty. I cannot prove mathematically that the flight that will take me from Sydney to London in a week or so's time will get me there, but I am prepared to stake my life on it. So there are many things in life where we cannot argue them mathematically or even completely logically, but we have to make deep commitments based on available evidence. And I wish to draw evidence from several sources, the first of which is history, because it's important for us to see the way in which this debate has changed. At the time of the rise of modern science in the 16th and 17th century, the idea that science and God do not mix would have been very strange to people like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and so on. In fact, more than that, historians of science, of whom you have one of great distinction here in Australia, Professor Peter Harrison, now at Queensland and was in Oxford a few years ago, argue that there is a deep connection between faith in God and the rise of modern science. Put very succinctly by C.S. Lewis, who said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. In other words, far from science and God failing to mix in the 16th and 17th centuries, they mixed so well that faith in God was the motor that drove science. And that is admitted by people of various religious persuasions and none. Melvin Calvin, who won the Nobel Prize for Biochemistry some years ago, said, on talking about the conviction that the universe was orderly, he said, I seem to find it in a basic notion discovered 2,000 to 3,000 years ago and enunciated first in the Western world by the ancient Hebrews, namely that the universe is governed by a single God and is not the product of the whims of many gods, each governing his own province according to his own laws. This monotheistic view seems to be the historical foundation for modern science. And Edwin Judge, a very distinguished ancient historian here in Australia, agrees with that thesis. So, putting it bluntly, I'm not remotely embarrassed to be both a scientist and a believer in God, since it was Christianity that arguably gave me my subject. Now, the problem, therefore, that arises immediately is what has happened between the 15th, 16th centuries and today. Isaac Newton believed in God, Stephen Hawking does not. They occupied the same chair at Cambridge. And I want to explore just a little bit why I think this change has occurred. And in my view, it has to do with fog, really, around certain concepts that need to be clarified. The first of them is confusion about the nature of God. Because you see, science and the gods don't mix at all. And science has done a very good job in getting rid of the type of God that is believed in by the ancient Greeks. The god of lightning, for instance, will disappear very rapidly on studying a little bit of atmospheric physics at the University of Western Australia. And it has got into the popular mind, driven by people like Richard Dawkins, that the God of the Bible, the God in whom I believe, is that kind of God. This came out of a debate I had at the Oxford Union last year. I was accused, quite correctly, of being an atheist with respect to a whole list of gods, beginning with Artemis and ending with Zeus. And the speaker then said, we just go one God more, and we get rid of Jehovah, the God of the Bible. In other words, what they're thinking of is that the God of the Bible is a God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. Now, as a scientist, I'm allergic to that accusation, and I take it extremely seriously, because there is sometimes a danger of people who profess belief in God of giving the impression that they simply see God in the things that science has not yet explained. Isaac Newton was not one of those, because his God was the God of the whole show, the bits that he could explain and the bits he couldn't. And when he discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, I've got a law, therefore I don't need God anymore. He said, well, he wrote the most brilliant book in the history of science, the Principia Mathematica, expressing explicitly the hope in it that it would persuade thinking people to come to believe in a deity. In a sense, you can see that Newton was arguing the way we all argue. The more you know about art, the more you can admire the genius of a Rembrandt, not the less. The more you know about engineering, the more you can admire the genius of a Rolls-Royce, not the less. And so the more you know about the universe, according to Newton, the more you can admire the genius of the God that did it that way. So the first point I'd want to make is this, and it's a very serious point. It's that if you think of God as a God of the gaps, then of course you've got to choose between God and science, because that's the way you've defined God. You've defined God as a placeholder, an X, that holds the fort until science has got an explanation. So, of course, by definition, you've got to choose between God and science. But if instead of believing in a God of the gaps, you believe in a creator God who's God of the whole show, that's a different matter. He doesn't disappear when we do more science. Which brings me to the flip side of this, and that is the nature of scientific explanation, where there's a great deal of confusion, I think, as well. The first thing is that there is an incipient scientism in our society, driven often again by the new atheists. And I would say that, of course, not all my atheist friends fall into the category of Richard Dawkins. But scientism seems to be very popular. It's the idea that science is the only way to truth. And that therefore, almost by implication, science is coextensive with rationality. Well, of course, that's nonsense, because if it were true, half the departments in every university in the world would have to close instantly. History, languages, and so on and so forth. It is, of course, a mistake to say with Bertrand Russell, what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. Because that statement, not being a statement of science, if it's true, it's false. It's too late at night for logic like that. Well, there we are. Sir Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize, very wisely said, you know, it's so easy to see that science is limited. It cannot answer the simple questions of a child. What's the meaning of my life? Where am I coming from? Where am I going? And Medawar talked a great deal of sense in that. He said, you have to look outside science. You have to look outside science, ladies and gentlemen, because sometimes we overrate science. Now, I'm speaking as someone who's absolutely passionate about science, and I've given my life, more or less, to mathematics. But we often say science explains. But what do we mean when we say science explains? You see, the law of gravity, for instance, what does that explain? Well, the one thing it doesn't explain is what gravity is, and Newton realized that. Nobody knows what gravity is. Nobody knows what energy is. And if you don't believe me, read Richard Feynman, one of the greatest physicists of the last century. It was Wittgenstein, the philosopher, that got the point brilliantly, and he said this: the deception of modernism, the supreme deception of modernism, is the idea that the laws of nature explain the world to us, when all they do is to describe structural regularities. You see, the law of gravitation is a work of genius. It enables us to, from a very simple mathematical formula, tell that the orbits of the planets around the sun are ellipses. It enables us even to do sufficiently accurate calculations to land somebody on the moon without any of Einstein's corrections. But it doesn't tell us what gravity is. So even on its own terms, saying science explains means we're not getting the whole story, even at the level of science itself. But then come the easier things to explain, but they are important. Why is the kettle boiling? Well, because heat energy from a lit Bunsen flame is being conducted through the copper at the base of the kettle, and that's agitating the molecules of water, and they're beginning to go faster and faster, and steam is rising. No, that's not why the kettle is boiling. It's boiling because I want a cup of tea. Well, I'm glad you laugh, because you see the difference in the nature of explanation. You see, to say those two explanations competed with one another or conflicted with one another would be patently silly. There's an explanation, a scientific one, and there's an agent explanation, a personal explanation. I want a cup of tea. So let me put it this way. God no more competes with science as an explanation than Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion as an explanation for the motor car. You need both. Of course you need both. And what I would suggest is this: we need to watch for false alternatives, God or science. I mentioned Peter Higgs at the beginning, who predicted brilliantly the existence of the Higgs boson that was discovered in CERN. And when it was discovered, Lawrence Krauss, who I believe was in your country last year, he said the Higgs boson is arguably more important than God. Well, that provoked the Irish in me a little bit. So I wrote an article for the Times to say, well, the Higgs boson is arguably more important than God if you're giving lectures on particle physics in a university. But if the question is, why is there a universe at all in which Higgs bosons exist, then God is arguably more important than the Higgs boson. And slightly cheekily, I finished my article by saying, so what shall we say about the Higgs boson? Well, Higgs predicted it, CERN discovered it, and God invented it. We celebrate the first two. What about the third? So the argument so far is very simple, actually. It's to do with explanation all the way down. And a lot of problem and fog, I believe, has been created by the suggestion that God is the same kind of explanation as a scientific explanation. When, of course, he isn't. God is a person, not a theory, for a start. And therefore, they're not even in the same category of thought. And so I would want to argue they do not conflict. But now there's a little side question that comes in from here, and that is another little bit of a fog, and that is confusion about the nature of faith. Our title is Cosmic Chemistry: Do God and Science Mix? And there's a very widespread impression. It has actually caused a new entry in Webster's dictionary, not yet in the OED, but it's there in Webster's. The new definition of faith is faith, noun, believing where there's no evidence. Or as Mark Twain put it, believing something you know ain't true. Now, of course, that's blind faith, and it is and can be very dangerous indeed. But the idea's got around that all faiths like that, when the word faith appears, it means religious faith which by definition means believing where there's no evidence. Now, I want to contest that very strongly, that faith, coming from the Latin word fides and in its Greek and Latin cognates, means commitment based on evidence. Evidence-based faith is something everybody understands, at least since the financial crisis. We thought we could trust certain people with a lot of money, and the markets then froze, didn't they? Why was that? Well, because there wasn't enough evidence-based, trust-based for confidence. And you know what evidence-based faith means. You'll find out all about it when you go and ask your bank manager for $1 million Australian dollars. He will want the evidence of the collateral before he will go near lending it to you. We all understand what that means. And it's important to realize, and all religions, of course, must face this for themselves. I can only speak as a Christian, that I wouldn't stand here for a microsecond if I didn't believe that my faith in God was evidence-based. And central to that are, of course, the facts of Christianity, the resurrection of Jesus, and so on. But the point I want to make at this point is, it is based on evidence. And the commitment, of course, to something very deep like belief in God requires more evidence than the commitment to some simple proposition. But unfortunately, there's a second side effect of this redefinition of the word faith. It's that what escapes people's attention is the business of science being faith-based. That may surprise some people. I find it surprises an increasing number of people, but Einstein realized it very clearly. He said, I cannot imagine a scientist without that faith. Now, he wasn't talking about faith in God, of course. He was talking about faith in what we might call the rational intelligibility of the universe. Or more simply, believing that science can be done because the universe is based on certain rational laws. And my teacher of quantum mechanics at Cambridge, Professor Sir John Polkinghorne, makes this point endlessly in his books. Physics is powerless to explain its faith, note the word, in the rational intelligibility of the universe, for the simple reason you have to believe in that intelligibility before you can do any physics at all. So let me now think about scientists doing science. What do we do it with? Well, we do it with our mind. Now, there's a huge question, and I tread on dangerous ground in front of a psychologist, I'm very aware. But let me go through the argument anyway. Because many of my atheist friends, and I have many at Oxford, when I ask them what the mind is, they say it is the brain. And when I ask them what the brain is, they say, well, essentially it's the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And then I gently say, and you trust it? I find that curious. If your iPad or iPhone or whatever you like, if you knew it was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, you wouldn't trust it for a moment. Now, interestingly, this doubt about rationality goes back to Darwin at least, and probably long before him. He said, with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. And that doubt has begun to worm its way into the intellectual world, not simply of people who believe in God, but of distinguished atheist thinkers like John Gray, Professor Emeritus of the History of European Thought at London University. Modern humanism, he writes, is the faith that through science humankind can know the truth and so be free. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, this is impossible. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. And Francis Crick, in his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, says a very similar thing. You, your joys and sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. In other words, this is the reductionist thesis, that everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry. To quote John Polkinghorne again, he says this program is ultimately suicidal. If Crick's thesis is true, we could never know it. For not only does it relegate our experiences of beauty, moral obligation, and religious encounter to the epiphenomenal scrap heap, it also destroys rationality. Thought is replaced by electrochemical neural events. Two such events cannot confront each other in rational discourse. They are neither right nor wrong, they simply happen. The very assertions of the reductionist himself are nothing but blips in the neural network of his brain. The world of rational discourse dissolves into the absurd chatter of firing synapses. Quite frankly, ends Polkinghorne, that cannot be right, and none of us believes it to be so. Now, more recently, two very distinguished philosophers, one a theist and the other an atheist, have given their take on this. Firstly, Alvin Plantinga. If Dawkins is right that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' own science and his atheism. Now listen to this statement, I find it fascinating. Dawkins' biology and his belief in naturalism would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing at all to do with God. And more recently, Thomas Nagel, a very distinguished American philosopher, wrote a book with a very innocuous title and a very explosive subtitle. The title was Mind and Cosmos. The subtitle was Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the World is Almost Certainly False. And what Nagel is saying is, he says we haven't given enough attention to thinking. C.S. Lewis said this in the 1940s. He said, we forget we're thinking about something, but we're not thinking at all about our thinking about that something. And he writes in Mind and Cosmos, if the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. Now, I'd like to illustrate this because I believe this argument is really going somewhere. I'd like to illustrate it just by telling you a story about Green Templeton College, where I work. We have dinners every Thursday night, very delightful dinners, but one of the snags sometimes is you cannot choose who you're sitting with. And I discovered that my dinner companion was a very distinguished biochemist who made the mistake of asking me what I did. I said, I'm a pure mathematician. He said, how dreadfully boring. And I said, well, I'm really sorry about the social ineptitude of my field. So I do try to make up for it by taking an interest in big questions. He said, what big questions? So I said, well, like the status of the universe. Is it created or not? Or the status of human life. Is it made in the image of God or not? Oh dear, he said, it's far worse than I thought. Listen, he said, I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, we have nothing to talk about, and we're going to have a miserable evening. Well, he meant it. So I panicked and smiled and said, no, we're not. We're going to have a fascinating evening. I said, I'm intrigued by reductionism. I said, I think you and I have something in common as scientists. He said, what's that? Well, I said, when we've got a large problem, we separate it into smaller problems. We try and solve the smaller problems to get insight in the big one. He said, that's exactly what I do. Well, I said, that's exactly what I do. We've got something in common. But he said, that's not what I meant. I said, no, it isn't, but at least we've got something in common. I said, you're an ontological reductionist, from the Greek word ontos, meaning being. You believe that everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry. He said, that's right. So I said, why don't we do an experiment? He said, what, at the dinner table? I said, sure, this is Oxford. He said, what's the experiment? I said, here it is, and I picked up the menu. Roast chicken. So he said, what's the problem? I said, none at all. But have a look at this, R-O-A-S-T. Those are marks on paper. Yes, he said, it's roast chicken. I said, how do you know that? It has meaning for you. And you're a reductionist. Yes, he said, I'm a reductionist. Everything in terms of physics and chemistry. Everything in terms of physics and chemistry. I said, okay, fine. Explain to me the semiotics of the letters, the way they bear meaning in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. And his wife was sitting there, and she said, get out of that if you can. But you know, he didn't try. He said something so stunning, it rings in my ears. He said, it can't be done. I said, what? He said, it can't be done. But I said, physics and chemistry, you know, we Irish learn to play devil's advocate. Physics and chemistry have only been going a few hundred years. He said, it doesn't matter, it can't be done. You cannot get to intelligence from the physics and chemistry. And he looked at me long and hard, and it suddenly dawned on me, he realized, which was quite correct, that I wasn't clever enough to have thought of the argument. He said, where did you get that argument? I said, from a famous Australian, Roger Sperry, who was one of the people that really got the scientific world to take consciousness seriously. But it's interesting, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen, because the twist now comes. ROAST, 5 letters, he recognized intelligent input. The same man in his laboratory studies DNA, a 3.5 billion letter word in a chemical alphabet of 4 letters called codons, because it codes for something, it has a semiotic dimension. And if I ask him where the origin of that, he'll say chance and the laws of nature. That's odd, isn't it? Fascinating to me. That you can recognize an intelligent input, whatever natural processes were involved in printing the thing, automatic processes. We know when we see something with linguistic structure that there has been somewhere along the line an intelligent input. Why not say the same thing for DNA? Now you see, people immediately react and they say, oh, God of the gaps again. No, it isn't God of the gaps. You see, reading a menu and postulating an intelligent author is not an author of the gap. It's the nature of what you're looking at that demands an explanation in terms of an intelligence. That is an explanation that makes sense. The reductionist one doesn't make sense. Now, you see, this is fascinating because we are told often that explanation always goes from the simple to the complex. It often does. But where language is concerned, it doesn't. Richard Dawkins once made the point to me. He said, you know, God couldn't be an explanation for anything because he's more complex than the thing you're explaining. Oh, I said, I pick up a book called The God Delusion. It's moderately complex. It's 400 pages long. So I ask where it came from, and I discover it comes from the much more complex mind of Richard Dawkins. So I reject that explanation because it's more complex than the thing you're explaining. It doesn't work with language. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, we started with 2 worldviews. Let me put them another way as I close. The first worldview, the materialistic one, is that there's nothing in this universe except mass and energy, essentially. And everything else is derivative, including life and mind and the idea of God, because there isn't a God. The other worldview is this. In the beginning was the Word. All things were made by him. All things came to be through him. So the 2 worldviews are starkly contrasted. The first one has mass, energy, primary, and mind derivative. The second one has mind primary and mass energy derivative. Cosmic chemistry. Do science and God mix? Yes, they do. Cosmic chemistry. Do atheism and God mix? Do atheism and science mix? I think with great difficulty, because these arguments, I believe, show that atheism doesn't only shoot itself in the foot, it shoots itself in the brain, and that's usually fatal. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Now, John and I have agreed we'll use first names. universities do get very attached to titles, but
Unfortunately.
both of us agree we should eschew them in favour of comradeship. So, John, a lot of the questions I was going to ask you have now been wiped away, and I've been busily scratching away here in order to come up with some questions that will get us started. I guess one of the things that strikes me is that in your story about boiling water and tea, you actually said, I think, that you need both explanations. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's one of the clear understandings here, that you actually need both explanations, that maybe they're different realms of inquiry and discourse, and trying to reconcile them is to try and reconcile the irreconcilable. So maybe you could expand a little on that idea of two levels of explanation and discourse. Do we have to try and bang their heads together?
No, I don't think we do, you see. And I don't think the early pioneers of science did, because they had a fairly clear idea that, in a sense, Kepler put it, we're thinking God's thoughts after him. It wouldn't have occurred to him that studying the motions of the planets was somehow competing with God as an explanation. Because God is the bigger level of explanation. He's the explanation of why there's something rather than nothing, of why there's a universe at all for science to study. But we've got ourselves into a bind, I really do believe, by twisting the concept of God back to the Greek ideas, and then using that as an Aunt Sally to dismiss that the God of the gaps, science can dismiss the God of the gaps. Well, of course, if you define God that way, science will dismiss that God, and good riddance, in my view. But that leaves, I believe, the God who created and sustained the universe absolutely untouched by the argument because of his nature.
And I guess for me that raises the question, you say God because of his nature. What idea of God and what nature? That's a difficult thing for people who are not believers, I think, when undertaking an explanation that comes out of a belief in God.
Oh, I agree with you, but there are other things that are equally difficult that we accept without thinking. Time, energy, gravity. We don't know what any of those things are, and yet we use the concept. So, in a sense, when you start with God, it's a bit like that. Augustine once said, everybody knows what time is until you try to define it. Now, attempting a definition of God is a very difficult thing. We have ideas of a being of infinite power, whatever infinite means, intelligence. We see a universe that's utterly glorious, so we think of God in terms of beauty and magnificence and all those kind of things. And the human mind exhausts itself. Now, I believe that part of the answer to your question, it begs another question, which you'll see instantly, but part of the answer to your question is that we can understand something of God from nature, not a great deal actually. Indeed, the Bible itself admits that and says we can see that there is a God and that he's of great power, and there's evidence in nature of rational intelligence. And that's a thing that a lot more people share than people who sit exactly in my chair. The second thing about that is that if we simply assume that it's human intelligence reaching out to define God, we'll rapidly run into great uncertainty and great difficulty. But it's here I have to bring something else in, which is inevitable in answer to this question, because I do believe it's logical, first of all, that if there is a God who created us, and in some sense we're in his image, so we are personal, he is personal, we know what love is, he knows what love is, it would be very surprising if the highest experience in human life, which is one person really disclosing themselves to another, relationship, friendship, if there is a God, didn't disclose himself. Now, this is where it comes down to the particularities of my Christian faith, which I can't avoid. You might want to avoid them at the moment, and I would understand that. But for me, it's two things. It's seeing in nature, the rational intelligibility of the universe is, for me, a very strong pointer to an intelligent God. And I've tried to point out that the atheist view just doesn't make sense because it dissolves rationality. That's one side of it. The other side of it is there a credible revelation within history? And I believe there is. Mm-hmm. But maybe you feel I'm not pleasing.
No,
Squeeze hard.
I'm not going to squeeze hard because I think it's more interesting for the audience to hear your views than mine. But I guess one of the things that comes out of your lectures, which I was reading in the last couple of days, is the question. And in a sense, it's a step away from the conversation we've just had, which talks about the nature of God and the relationship of a God with an individual human being. The irreconcilable nature of scientific explanation and religious explanation is something that you raised in this question. Can a scientist believe in the resurrection? And you might equally say in miracles or the virgin birth. Yeah. I mean, how can someone who's scientifically trained, I don't mean the scientists, the reductionists, the determinists, because they're a caricature of scientists too, in my view, in the same way as extremists of religious persuasion are not typical. But how can an ordinary, everyday scientist, in a sense, believe in the resurrection?
Your question is very fair, and I'm glad you said the first two things because we share that view of extremism. This is the question that really I ought to address in the lecture in a sense because it's a big and important question. Many people say after listening to a lecture like that, they say, well, half a minute, David Hume showed long ago that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. Now, you're a scientist. You claim to believe in the laws of nature. So please, how can you possibly believe in miracles and so on? Well, there are two questions here. There's an in-principle question. I do believe in the resurrection, but that's a specific claim for a miracle. And what I've found in my experience is nobody's prepared to listen to evidence for that if you haven't had a brief look at least at the in-principle question. And there I found C.S. Lewis inordinately helpful because Hume's idea, and I've studied Hume and tried to understand him, he conflicts with himself a bit. I got to know Antony Flew just before he died. And Antony Flew, who was Hume's greatest interpreter in the 20th century, said Hume was wrong and I was wrong, and I would have to rewrite all my books on this question. And essentially what it boils down to is this. I don't think Hume was right when he said miracles are violations of the laws of nature. And it's here that C.S. Lewis has got this beautiful illustration. So I'm staying in a very pleasant place here in Perth. So I put $100 in my drawer last night, and I put $100 tonight, so that's $200. And tomorrow morning I find $50. So what do I conclude? That the laws of arithmetic have been broken, or the laws of Australia?
Or the laws of your own mind, perhaps.
Well, okay, let's leave the laws of my own mind, or my wife's taken it to go shopping. I know that's all possible. But the interesting thing is we laugh because we immediately see that the uses of the word law are different in both cases. And that's the problem. We are used to law, the law of the state, and violation, because we're thinking of law as something with the police behind it and all this kind of thing. But what are the laws of science? They're simply our descriptions of what normally happens. God has ordered a regular universe with things that normally happen. Now, the irony is, Hume said, of course, in the time of the New Testament, people were primitive, pre-scientific, and so they could see miracles everywhere. He's simply wrong. Because the only way they recognized the resurrection of Jesus as being a miracle was because they knew that dead bodies don't just spring up all over the place. They knew the norm. And it's the same all over the place. Mary, who was betrothed to Joseph, when she became pregnant, Joseph knew exactly where babies came from, and he wanted to divorce her. He didn't accept her explanation in terms of a miracle until a lot of pressure was put upon him. So my first point is, one, that they did know the laws of nature then, enough of them to recognize an exception. But secondly, and here's the important thing, when God raised Christ from the dead, he didn't break any laws of nature because this was energy coming in from outside. The critical philosophical question that lies behind this is the universe a closed system or not? I don't believe it is. And that therefore God, who made the regularities, can feed something in. He doesn't violate any laws. Now, if I were claiming, final point, that Jesus rose from the dead through some natural processes going on in the grave, then it would be violating the laws. So I simply think Hume is wrong. So there's a way to sit with it as a scientist with a completely easy conscience, really.
I guess that does raise that question that we discussed earlier about the different forms of explanation and the fact that, in a sense, they're not reconcilable because they're two entirely different ways of looking at the world, is what it seems to me.
Well, would you say they're not reconcilable, or they're just two different
ways
that can live perfectly well together?
There's no reason to try and
they don't
butt their
conflict.
heads.
Yes,
no.
that's right.
And maybe I can just have one last indulgent question as a psychologist, because you said one of the things that we haven't done much of is thinking about thinking.
Yes.
And of course the discipline from which I sort of fled many years ago and have since returned to is in part about thinking. And it seems to me that one of the problems in a lot of this debate is the desire for absolute certainty at a time, especially in the study of human behaviour and consciousness, where our knowledge is very partial and slight. We know more about the cosmos than we do about ourselves, the way we develop, the way we think, and thinking about thinking is really pretty early in scientific terms. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, whether you come across that absolutism.
I can comment on it because I come from a race of people that love absolutism. and what I would say is this, that I take your point, and the consciousness debate is utterly fascinating. I think if I were younger, I probably haven't the ability to be a neuroscientist, because I think that's where the big questions are going to come. And I've thought a little bit about it and actually written a bit about it, but the point to my mind is this, that it's absolutely true that certain people crave certainty. Now, a craving for certainty, of course, as a psychological phenomenon, does not of itself mean that certainty cannot be had. And I know no other way of dealing with this kind of thing but on the basis of evidence. Let me transmute the thing or transpose it into a different key. Am I certain that my wife loves me? Now, I'm sure you could advance all kinds of psychological questions and so on. And I would say, with my mathematical head, no, you can't be absolutely certain. But you can have confidence beyond reasonable doubt that you'd stake your life on it. And I think one of the ways, let me put it this way, the psychological question has driven my life. Let me be open with you, Carmen. Because of Ireland. I had an experience in my first week at Cambridge where a student said to me, "Do you believe in God?" And he said, "Oh, sorry. Oh, I shouldn't have asked you that. You're an Irishman. All you Irish believe in God and you fight about it." You see, Irish DNA, Irish genetics, and I remember it was a turning point in life. I'd heard this before, of course. And I thought, well, how do you really settle this? And I thought one way I can go about it, now I'm at this university, is to openly engage, and here's the important thing, befriend people that don't share my worldview. Try to sit in their shoes, learn why they think what they think, and so on and so forth. And it was a very important day in my life when I actually experienced a friend of mine who's a much brighter mathematician than me, who, after wrestling, he was an agnostic background and so on, after wrestling with these questions from his perspective, he came to the conclusion that Christianity was true. And that, to my mind, you can change your worldview. And you mentioned in your introduction my visits to Eastern Europe and Russia and so on. A lot of it was driven by the same thing. Here are people who've been totally enculturated by a different culture. Now, will my faith in God stand up to that, or will it disappear? So I've tried, at least existentially and experientially, to answer your question. And I would agree, as a scientist, of course, you can't have absolute certainty. But I've gradually, over my life, that certainty, as I've seen questions answered by Christianity, which are not answered by other sources, of course, confidence builds up. So I'm at the point where I'd stake my life on it. But I take your point. I take your point.
Okay, thank you very much, John. I now have an iPad here, which I think I can read, with your questions on it. And the first of them actually comes directly, really, from what you've just been saying, John, but I think I'll ask it anyway because it's a slightly different emphasis. So how do you think your upbringing in Northern Ireland influenced your worldview and your perception of the intertwining of science and religions?
It influenced it a great deal. My parents had a very modest education, but they were very remarkable. And this touches on your subject of research. In a very sectarian country, they were Christian without being sectarian. Now, what do I mean by that? They employed Protestants and Catholics equally in their business and were bombed for it. My father believed that all human beings were made in the image of God and therefore of infinite value, and therefore you must not discriminate on the basis of religion. Now, that was a courageous stand. So I didn't grow up with the sectarian baggage that so many of my contemporaries grew up with. The next remarkable thing was they allowed me to think. I mean, I can clearly remember when I was about 13, my dad said to me, "Have you ever read the Communist Manifesto?" I said, "No." Well, he said, "Here's one. I think you should read it." So I grew up in a Christian environment that was totally open and expansive and exploratory of everything. And it was a puzzle to me when I suddenly discovered, of course, as you do very rapidly, that there's a lot of narrow-mindedness and fanaticism and fundamentalism going on. That openness to the world, to study everything you could, to read everything you could, I owe my parents an unrepayable debt. But what they did not do was close my mind down. And what I noticed when I got to Cambridge, there were other people from Northern Ireland, and the moment they got away from the place, all religion disappeared, of course, because it never was their own personal conviction. Mine, very rudimentary, I expect,
was tribal,
at the time.
I guess.
It was tribalized. And so, you know, I used to hate the drums, whoever played them. If you see what I mean in that context,
I do.
yes.
Yes. Thank you. The next question is, how do we, I'm sorry we can't say who's asking these questions, but you'll recognise yourself. How do we fit the creation timeline from a biblical perspective to correspond to the timeline the geologists use to explain how oil and gas are formed?
How long have you got? Well, let me give the brief answer to that. Well, let me attempt an answer to that. Q&A is just the way I would begin to approach it. Without much difficulty, actually, to my mind. It has to do with taking the Bible seriously. Now, this will seem very strange to some people. It's precisely because I take the language of the Bible seriously that I don't have a difficulty. And in Hebrew, and I'm not an expert, but I do consult the experts when you go outside your own field, as I'm doing tonight all the time. You must consult the experts. So what they tell me is this. The beginning of the Bible is a statement, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, you see. Now, when was that? Now, often people say, well, that wasn't day one, and these days are 6 days of 1 week in a recent age. And now I must make a confession. I don't know whether I told you I come from Armagh. Do you know who was there? Archbishop Usher, yes. Who wrote to the Vice-Chancellor at Cambridge saying, Adam was born on the 5th of October, 4004 BC at 9 o'clock in the morning, but he was sorry he couldn't go into more detail than that. Okay, bless the dear Archbishop. But anyway, the point about the Hebrew language I want to make is a very simple one. The sequence of days, whatever you think about them, are detached from the first statements of the Bible by tense. There are 2 different past tenses used, and the in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth is in a tense which tells you that that bit is not part of what follows. So whatever you believe about the days, the Bible says nothing about the age of the earth. So if the Earth's just over 4 billion at the current, the universe 13.8, I find no difficulty with that. The fact that it has a finite age is the thing that fascinates me. That the Bible for centuries, and I pointed this out in a very famous scientific establishment in Switzerland not long ago, that for centuries the Bible has been saying there was a beginning. But it was only in the 1960s that science caught up with it. So it's the fact of the beginning, not when there was a beginning. The final point is, if people are interested in what I think about this, I'll do a shameless bit of advertising. I've written a book about it called 7 Days That Divide the World.
Yes, yes. And I think, if I can just interject here, most thinking people don't accept that sort of literal reading if they're engaging in a debate about science and religion, that there always have been reasonable explanations in a sense.
Yes, that's right. But the problem comes in the word literal.
Yes.
The word literal is almost useless. Take that first chapter of Genesis, and God said. In what sense? Does God have a voice box and lungs? Of course he doesn't. You're using the word said as a metaphor, which we understand to mean God communicated. So there, in that very first chapter, there are non-literal things, but here comes the snag. They're literal at another level. Sometimes when people ask me, do you take the Bible literally? I say, you don't. Jesus said, I am the door. What? A door like that? Well, of course not. Well, how do you know that? Because you've experienced in the natural world. But then the mistake, and I owe so much to Lewis. I used to go and listen to him in Cambridge in those days. And he taught me a lot about my own language. That Jesus is not a door in the literalistic sense, but he's a real door. And Lewis makes the point. A metaphor usually stands for something real. And we mustn't make the mistake that if there's a metaphor, it doesn't stand for something real. And that approach, I find, for me, clears up a lot of the difficulty, but not all of it, of course.
Of course. There are some elements, I'm sure, of the Old Testament that would be difficult. Next question. What do you think of the new multiverse idea to explain that our universe is just one of many and a Goldilocks one with the right physical and laws to permit life?
Well, I find it a fascinating idea. I sometimes wonder, but this will express a terrible bias if it's not a desperate way of dealing with the question. Again, it sets up a false alternative. Max Tegmark, the man in Princeton who was responsible for generating this idea that there's an infinite number of universes in which anything that can happen will happen. So it's not surprising you're in this one, because after all, it's the only kind of one you could find yourself in. Those arguments don't work very well, I think. Firstly, Max Tegmark says there's either a multiverse or there's a creator. Now, the problem is created by the extreme fine-tuning of our universe. It is so special. And we have discovered that over the past 50 years. Amazingly special. Roger Penrose, one of my colleagues at Oxford, who's not a theist at all, but he puts it in theistic language. He said, to have a universe like this in which there's a second law of thermodynamics, the creator's aim, and I'm quoting him, has to be accurate to 1 part in 10 to the power 10 to the power 123, which is a number so big that if you put a 1 here and a 0 in every elementary particle in the universe, you can't even write it out to the base 10. So it's incredible how precise our universe has to be in order to have life on it. So that has been part, not the only cause, but part of the reason that the multiverse has been generated in, because people have thought that by increasing the number of universes, you somehow increase the probability of having a universe like this one to a likelihood. Now, unfortunately, one of my friends who was a world authority on this question, sadly has got dementia, said, unfortunately, it commits something called the reverse Gambler's fallacy. And the number of universes doesn't help the probability at all. But secondly, there's no access to any of these universes. And John Polkinghorne, who's a very distinguished quantum theorist, he rejected. Interestingly, Hawking has used it massively in his book, The Grand Design. And Roger Penrose has reacted, saying it's overused. It's an excuse for not having a real theory, which is pretty strong scientific language. So the idea it's God or the multiverse is, of course, logically false. God can create as many universes as he likes. So it's not the alternative Tegmark was setting up. And if you want to know any more of what I think about it, I'm not an expert on it, but I've tried to respond to what's being said. I've got a little book called God and Stephen Hawking. Whose design is it anyway? I don't find it myself very convincing, but There may be. Let's keep an open mind. I want to see evidence.
As you say, it doesn't seem to be critical to the argument in any case.
No, it's not. That's the point. It appeared to be critical to the argument. Everybody jumped on the bandwagon. But people are beginning to realize it is not critical to the argument.
Here's someone who's being a bit tougher on you, perhaps, than I have been. Aside from analogies such as kettles and complex minds behind cars and books, do you have anything more rational to support your faith? An analogy, after all, is not evidence. Shri.
Well, I would have regarded all of those things I said as perfectly rational because you understood them and have responded in your question, evidencing that they are perfectly rational. So more rational than that, of course not. But you see, these aren't simply analogies. DNA is a real word in another language. And all our experience, if science is based on experience, to quote a very famous atheist, now turned Christian, on the basis of what he discovered, then DNA must be a product of intelligence. These seem to be arguments that are coming directly from experience, and if you want to argue that science is based on experience, then they are very powerful arguments. So I simply reject the question that that it's more rational. But leaving that little quibble aside, I pointed out earlier that arguments for God come in different sizes. There are what I would call, and this is very loose, objective kind of arguments, what you can read off in nature and so on, although of course there's always a subjective element. But then there's the narrower side of the Christian teaching and revelation and so on. And I regard Christ himself as the supreme evidence for the existence of God and the nature of God. And to begin to answer that person's question, I would have to bring that in, although it's not strictly in our title tonight.
And one of the things psychologists are now very impressed by is our predictable irrationality. So perhaps in all of these discussions we underestimate the extent to which we shape the debate and the argument to suit our purposes.
Absolutely. I mean, Feynman, I like, the physicist I quoted earlier. He has in one of his books, that it really struck me when I read it, he said, bend over backwards to criticize yourself because you're the easiest one to deceive by yourself.
Excellent. Next question. How do I explain, and it's in quotes, life doesn't come from non-life, but God has no beginning, so he existed from nothing? Do you want me to repeat that?
Yes, please.
How do I explain, and this is in inverted commas, life doesn't come from non-life, but God has no beginning, so he existed from nothing?
But if God has no beginning, that doesn't make sense to me. He can't have existed from nothing. If he's always existed, he's always existed. I'm not quite sure what lies behind that, but there could be a number of things. Let me try to explore a couple of them. Life does not come, I believe, from non-life. It requires an informational input. And the exciting thing about that is we have lived to experience the information age. Darwin had no idea of this stuff. He had no idea of DNA, its code, and all this kind of thing. And the supreme irony here is this, that life we now know involves something non-material, and that is information. Now, this is a huge debate at the moment. The carriers of information are usually material, as you see in that advert for the City Bible Forum up there. They're material, but the information itself is non-material. So here's the supreme irony that materialism appears to disappear. This is what Thomas Nagel is pointing out, because we now have the category of information. So some scientists are actually rather neatly saying it's not bit from it, it's it from bit, because the information is primary. But the second thing about God, and here I'm just trying to go around this question because I don't quite understand it, God existing from nothing. The usual question that's at the heart of Richard Dawkins' book on this is, look, if you claim that God created the universe, then something will have to have created him and so on. Who created God and who created it and so on. Well, I was surprised, to be honest, to find that in his book as such an important piece, because if you say who or what created God, let's abstract one level. Who or what created X? You're assuming X was created. It's what many philosophers call a complex question. It hides an assumption. Who created X assumes X was created. So if God was not created, the question who created God doesn't apply to him at all. And the irony in that was, Richard Dawkins and I had a little debate about this on one occasion. And I said, look, you're bypassing the question of God. The God of the Bible wasn't created, so your question doesn't apply. But I said, you believe the universe created you. So let me ask you your question. Who created your creator? And I've waited a long time for an answer to that.
So, on to perhaps more predictable terrain, but equally difficult, I think. Why did God create human beings? The big why questions are always the hardest.
Well, they are, of course, and I take them seriously because, as you know from your research, much more than I know from mine, this is a very deep existential question. Why am I? And I can only answer it in the following way. I can't second guess God. That's the first thing, obviously. But the second thing is, there is a statement of great magnificence in the final book of the Bible, which is a bit like a music piece, you know. It could be set to music very easily, and it has been many times, where heaven is praising God as creator. And the reason given talks about human beings, and it says, by your will they were and were created. Well, that's ancient English, so let me put it up into modern English. If I'm asked that question directly, I would say that I exist because God wanted me to be. I know that raises thousands of other questions, and I can see them forming in your mind. But let's stick with that just for a moment. The biblical idea that humans are made in the image of God is for me of vast importance because it influenced my father, remember. That as I look out at other people, everybody I meet, and of course I forget it. I mess things up as well as the next person. But the idea that every person I meet is made in the image of God and is therefore of infinite value, and I should be prepared to learn from them and treat them seriously and so on. That's a magnificent thing. I can't get behind that, though. I can't get any further down in. You know, you see, let's transmute that into the ordinary family. I've got a daughter and 2 sons, and a son comes to me, why am I? Because I wanted you to be. You can't get behind that, can you?
Well, I guess the question is
whether
it's no, I'm sure I can't. But the question for a lot of people is whether it needs to be in the image of God in order to regard all human beings as equally worthy and to be treated in an appropriate way and dealt with justly and fairly doesn't actually require a theology.
Oh, well, no.
I mean, that whole...
Thank you for that.
Yes,
Thank you for
yes,
that, because it's very important I say something on that. I would be the last person to give anyone the impression that that was the case. You see, from where I sit, and this is the slight twist on this, that precisely because I believe everybody is made in the image of God, whether they believe in God or not, that means I believe they're moral beings, whether they believe in God or not. And so they have a moral sense. Now, you may account for that moral sense in a different way from what I do, but in the expression, it often comes to exactly the same thing. Not that I think that the theology doesn't matter, but the last thing I would do is give the impression that you have to believe in God in order to have a very high regard for your fellow men and women and to regard their morality highly.
Of course, some do have that view, and it's one of the tensions, obviously, between...
It's one of the terrible tensions, yes. Absolutely.
Yes. Look, there's a wonderful question here from a 14-year-old who says, I'm 14 and I feel as though God does not speak to me. Why doesn't he?
What a fascinating question. Well, I admire a 14-year-old who comes up in the crowd like this with a question. You feel that God doesn't speak to you. Now, that's a very personal question. How does God speak to us? Some people imagine that God speaks to us by you hear a voice and all this kind of thing. If I'm asked the question about God speaking, the way I would answer it is this. where I sense, and of course, this is highly subjective, and I'm aware of it, but you've asked me the question. One of the things that really convinces me that Christianity is true is when I reflectively and meditatively read Scripture, take the Bible seriously. There are times, doesn't happen all the time, where I sense in a very real way that God is speaking to me. And what I would suggest to anybody, whatever age they are, and I was into these things when I was 14, is if you want to hear God speak to you, ask him and just start reading Scripture. And I believe he will honor us. He won't speak all the time. And there are all kinds of arguments that will say, well, it's your imagination and all this kind of thing. And okay, but the arguments don't prove it isn't real. They don't prove it is not real either. So that would be my suggestion for someone that senses God isn't speaking to them.
So it's not a question of why he doesn't. That was the second part of the question. Why doesn't he speak to me?
Well, how could I possibly answer that? You see, sometimes God is speaking very plainly when we don't realize it. I mean, in Scripture itself, there are moral norms. And I don't have to pray or get any special guidance not to steal things, for instance. And I believe that that's a first level of God speaking in his word. But to guess why, sometimes, people are hurting because they've had very negative experience of God. And they find it very difficult to, for instance, a child who's had an abusive relationship will find it very difficult to understand what it means for God to be Father. And it can take a long time for those things to work through. And this needs very sensitive handling. And it can't be answered in a crowd this size. I would encourage the young person involved to talk to somebody that they can really trust and talk about these things and find someone who can be a little bit of a mentor.
Okay. One of the questions I had here has disappeared, if that can be reinstated. The one from a psychologist, I think. But in the meantime, I want to follow up on that question, really. It's a slightly different angle. And that is the question, why do you think, and this is perhaps a little personal, having heard the same messages, having read the same material, having examined some of the same questions, some people come to believe in God and some do not?
Oh, I thought you were going to say some people come to different political views.
Well, is it like a political view? Well, I mean, I think you're saying it's more than that. It's not just a view. You called it a worldview earlier, but
yes
is it like a political view?
Because yes and no. I'm saying both and in a sense, because we are very complex people. And it's not simply a matter of ticking off a series of boxes and answering the questions. You see, now I'll have to be personal. You've given me permission, have you?
Indeed.
To be personal. I have to speak as a Christian here. You see, I mentioned before that Christianity is not a philosophy, merely. It is a relationship. And relationship demands certain things. I can never get to know you and you never get to know me unless we're prepared to give up our distance. That's one of the prerequisites. And when we are approaching God, then Christ will make certain demands of us. And becoming a Christian, which is a step of commitment, but it's based on two things. It's based on repentance, changing your mind, metanoia in Greek, to change your mind, to agree with God that we have messed things up and so on, and to trust him and to accept him as Lord. In the early Christian centuries, the basic Christian confession was Jesus Christ is Lord. Now, I talk to many, many people around the world, and there are people that investigate and they'll say, well, there seems to be a strong bit of evidence, but here, half a minute, I'm not prepared for this commitment. So that the problem moves out of the intellectual sphere, strictly speaking, into the moral sphere and into the will. It's heart, mind, and will. It's all three. So people can read the very same things and they can come to the conclusion that they decide to say no. And I believe that God loves us all so much, he will honor that choice. He'll not force his way in. That would be totalitarianism. That would be horrible. So you've got a situation where there are bigger things at play. And the moral things and the issue of repentance and so on are very real things. And some people say, look, sorry, the cost is too big for me. That's one thing.
I mean, it may be that that hurdle, in a sense you're speaking about, is not one of commitment or will, but of a perception that we sometimes call faith. I mean, the creed says, I believe in one God, credo in unum deum.
Yes.
And many people get to a certain point in their lives where that makes no sense at all. And it's not that they have willfully ignored, but that that act of faith, which is required, is simply not possible. Is that not different from what you were talking about?
Well, I meet many people that say that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Often, not always, but often they've had a religious upbringing, but it's been second-hand. Mm. And they've never thought through their faith as adults. And there's been a big mismatch between their professional and intellectual development and their experience of God. It's been very much a private thing, rather than something they can articulate in the public sphere. The moment you mentioned that question, I was thinking of I was doing something for the business school, lecturing some executives from IBM. And when I'd finished, I don't know what I'd said in the talk, but somebody stood up and vigorously slammed into me for about half an hour. Obviously the spokesman for the group, you see. And it was all about God, although I'd hardly mentioned God in the talk. And in the end, he said, you know, I'm sorry for doing this. I said, don't be sorry, it's fine. But he said, I want to tell you why I'm doing it. He said, the trouble is, he said, you know, I had this stuff shoved into me, and then it became meaningless. That's what I remember of what he said. There's only one case in point. And he said, I haven't bothered. But he said, now I've reached the top. And there's nowhere to go, and these questions are all nagging and coming back. And I want to know if you've got something real, and I'm going to give you a jolly rough time until I discover it. And I thought that was very fair. It's a sort of, and I meet that with many people, that their experience has been something that no longer makes sense because it never really did make sense in the first place.
Thank you. We have a couple of extra questions now, one of which refers to the earlier observation you made about God creating humans in his own image. The question is, if God created humans in his own image, how is it that villains and criminals exist in the world?
Well, we'd love to have a world without the possibility of criminality, but then there'd be no humans in it. God could have created us all as robots, and that wouldn't have been very boring, it seems to me. I wouldn't like a robotic wife, particularly, who kissed on instruction. If you pressed the iPad, mark kiss. I think the serious point behind this
There is the whole free will determinism question.
That's
and
exactly
religion.
what I'm coming to.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I'm coming to. And this is, as you know better than me, this is a hard question. But it seems to me that part of our human dignity is that we're capable of saying yes or no. And that makes us capable of love. You can't love in a robotic universe, it seems to me. There's no love in artificial intelligence. Now, I know that raises another huge question. But you see, let me turn it back to the family and start there. The first child I had, I remember holding a little girl in the hospital and realizing, goodness me, this little being could grow up to reject me. And that was an awesome realization. Well, why have children then? Well, because the risk is worth taking in that sense. And I think in a real way to put that up in the higher level, God took a risk. He created beings like himself in that they were personal beings capable of love, which means they must be capable of wrong. And C.S. Lewis pointed out that if you're going to have a real world in which real choice is possible, you can't have wood, for example, remaining stiff when I use it to build a house, but if I was going to hit you with it, it suddenly dissolves. The universe has got to have a certain fixed nature, and unfortunately, the very nature of things, I cannot see it any other way. The very nature of things is that if you're going to have love, then there must be the possibility of saying no, and it ends up with the possibility of criminality. But there's another question that comes secretly underneath that, you see. Granted, it was a risk because God made provision. And there I believe the Christian doctrine, this brings up the whole question of the flip side of that is criminality, suffering, and all this kind of stuff. And that's the hardest question we face, isn't it?
Yes, well, living in the 21st century particularly.
Exactly.
Another question, I guess, which also encompasses the idea that believers or theists, people who believe in a particular faith particularly, presume to know the mind of God. And this question, I suppose, is based on that presumption, which is that we're all working towards something, but where do you think we're ultimately heading? And where does God, I suppose, if I can add to it, believe we should head? Can you say should about God?
Well, we are all working towards something. Well, we may be, but it's different for different people. I'm not quite sure what the thrust of the question should be in terms of an answer.
Where do you think we're all ultimately heading is the second part of the question.
What, as a globe, as a...
I think you can freely speculate. I presume it would be in the context of an understanding of God's will, the idea of God's will, perhaps.
I can't even tell you where Scotland's heading.
Our Prime Minister thinks he knows where it should be going.
I think you would have more idea on that than I have.
Okay, well,
general speculations are very difficult, ladies and gentlemen. I want to try and take it seriously. Where are we heading? If I wanted to make one comment on that and refer to the West, where are we heading? Well, we're increasingly heading into a vast moral vacuum. Now, from where I sit, what is happening is exactly what Nietzsche predicted. Now, Nietzsche was a very interesting person, and he pointed out that if you get rid of God, you'll in the end get rid of humanity. And I shall never forget, I've spent a lot of time in Russia, particularly in the Far East and Siberia. And many Russian intellectuals have said this to me: we thought we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings, and we found we couldn't. Now, this is Dostoevsky. If God does not exist, everything is permissible. Now, of course, he didn't mean that there'd be no morality, but he did mean there's no rational justification for it. And I fear myself that if we teach generations of kids that they are merely animals, that there's nothing special about humankind, they will begin to behave as such. And we will not be able to do anything much against it. And this is the problem that every state faces. You see, let me extrapolate from that. And this is a huge debate. It really is a debate for another evening. But I take it very seriously, because it seems to me if you abolish the transcendent, abolish God, who's been in the West at least a mainstay of morality for centuries, you're not left without morality. But what happens is there is a desperate then search to base morality down here in there. And the trouble is, we have competing moralities. I mean, to put it very crudely and simplistically, Darwin was a kind man who observed ants and their cooperation. There's a base for altruism. Spencer observed the struggle of the survival for the fittest. Apply that in morality and you know where it ends up, in the gas chambers. And the trouble is, ladies and gentlemen, if you abolish the vertical dimension, morality, in my view, and I've been asked my view, ends up as being merely personal opinion. So Morality will be determined by law, and law will be determined by the power structures. If there's no anchor beyond, it becomes a matter of personal, powerful opinion. And that, to my mind, is a pretty hideous thing.
I guess we could argue that one
I guess
substantially, because as a question I raised earlier about the bases for ethics.
Yes, that's right.
And I don't think there is demonstrably not a single one. I mean, Stalinist Russia clearly isn't a model that any sane human being would wish, any more than Nazi Germany would be, or some fundamentalisms, that these views may or may not have religious underpinning. They're all equally destructive. That doesn't tell us, I think, anything about the mind of God.
I'm not sure that they're all equally destructive,
Well,
but they're
destructive.
They're horrifically destructive. And I am concerned, of course, at removing a base. You see, there seems to me to be a parallel. And we were talking about cosmic chemistry, do science and God mix. And one of my arguments is that you can't get rationality from non-rationality. You can't get life from non-life. And I would agree here with David Hume that you can't get morality, you can't get ought from is. Now that could lead us into a very big, and that's what's being attempted very powerfully at the moment. And if you read the writings of the new atheists, who mercifully do not represent the majority of atheists, they will say that science has got to be the provider of a moral base. There's no other possible source. And that's scary.
Well, I think that's an argument many people would dispute.
No, of course it is. And many atheists would dispute it.
And it isn't inherently scientific either.
No, it's not at all scientific.
Okay, so maybe we'll try and marry it a little closer to science. There are lots of other interesting questions we can ask. But one I think is important because of the nature of the conversation we've had, and that is the question that says, 1 billion people in the world believe in Allah and that Muhammad was his prophet. Does this mean 1 billion people's fervent beliefs are dead wrong, in your opinion?
How do you decide questions like that? And I could add Hindus,
yes,
and Buddhists,
yes,
and everybody else.
Yes.
I know of only one way of dealing with questions like that, and that's on a matter of evidence. Now, the moment a question like that comes, there are dangers, and you know them. There are very big dangers, and there are profound dangers of misunderstanding. That if we criticize another religion, we're somehow looking down on the people who practice it as lesser beings. Now, we covered that before, and I hope it's clear where I sit. But I'll speak freely, ladies and gentlemen, because I've had these discussions and have them constantly with my friends who are Muslims and Jews and so on. So let me just, since you mentioned Islam, let me just keep to the major monotheistic traditions for a moment. My Jewish friends believe that Jesus died and did not rise. My Muslim friends believe he didn't die. I believe he both died and rose. All three of those things can't be correct. They're all historical assertions. How do you approach history? By historical methods. And I know no other way of doing it. And the interesting thing is, when I speak about these things with my Jewish and Muslim friends, they agree entirely with me. And if you leave Christianity out of it altogether, Hinduism, versions of which have hundreds of millions of gods, will never agree with Islam. The fact is, religions differ. Now, how to approach these things, to my mind, is in one sense the way I approach everything else. What is the evidence? And part of the reason, a major part of the reason why I'm a Christian, is that I believe the evidence shows that Jesus both died and rose again. So that excludes the other two possibilities.
And maybe this next question is very pertinent in that case. Is there any scientific evidence that has ever made you doubt your beliefs?
Doubt is a tendentious word, because the trouble is, the moment the word doubt appears, people think of that sickening black hole feeling that the whole world is collapsing. Dubitari, to be in two minds. I have spent my whole life doubting my faith in God. In other words, putting it to the test, asking questions, as I'm doing tonight. And that kind of doubt is simply the flip side of faith. Faith is trust. Why would you trust? Because your questions are being answered. What are your questions? They're proceeding from partial uncertainties. Now, certain doubts can be sorted out by information. I doubt whether the plane's going at 9 o'clock in the morning or not. We'll look up a timetable and that'll solve that doubt. Some doubts are very easy to resolve. So that kind of doubting I've done all the time, and I'm doing it tonight. My faith can come under fire and so on. When I was asked that question at Cambridge all those years ago, that was the time when I really did try to stand back. And I've constantly tried to do it. Now, when the big crises in life come, you will ask serious questions, very serious questions. But I'm trying to respond completely honestly to your question. I don't recall any incident in life that's brought me to that sickening feeling that there's a black hole and the whole thing is disappearing and God is gone. But I know many Christians that have gone, and I've sat with them, and they very frequently they come through it. I just haven't had that experience.
Thank you. And this is, I suppose, in a way, a cheeky question, but related. What's the strongest point that you've encountered in support of atheism? This comes from the audience.
Well, yeah.
I'm not doing it.
Well, put my atheist hat on. I think that, let me rephrase it slightly. I understand people have become atheists because of the problem of pain and suffering, more than I understand any other reason. And, you know, I've stood in Auschwitz many times and wept every time. I just find overwhelming. And the pain and the tsunamis and the earthquakes. I arrived in New Zealand 2 days after the earthquake. And it was earthquakes why all the way through. So that's the hardest question. And I have every sympathy for people that become atheists because of it. But I don't think atheism solves it at all. And I can say something briefly on that if you want me to. The problem is there are two things. It's one thing to be an oncologist. It's another thing to be told you have 3 months to live. And so the whole problem of pain and suffering looks differently from you being an armchair philosopher and really going through it yourself. There's an intellectual side and there's a pastoral side. Now on the intellectual side, one of the big problems that faces me with the kind of atheism Dawkins represents, where he says in the end the universe is just like you'd expect it to be. If at the bottom there's no good, there's no evil, there's no justice, DNA just is and we dance to its music. Well, that's the abolition of all morality, and I find it difficult to understand how he can even begin to talk of the problem of evil, which he does frequently. So there's a philosophical problem in the middle of that. But secondly, if you think, as many of my friends do, they say, look, I've solved the problem, there isn't any God, and this is just how life is. I can understand that. But, of course, they haven't removed the pain. And they haven't removed the suffering. What they have clearly removed is all hope. So I, as a Christian, have a problem with evil and suffering. My atheist friends think they've solved it, but actually they haven't removed it at all. And the difficulty is they've removed the thing that they themselves very frequently believe in most strongly, and that is justice. Because, let's face it, the vast majority of people who have ever lived will never get justice. They won't get it in this life, and there's no afterlife to get it in. So it's a pretty bleak situation. I once said this to Richard Dawkins, and he said, well, because it's bleak, it doesn't mean it's false. Well, I said, it doesn't mean it's true either. So, final point I'd like to make is this: how do I face the question? And we can philosophize, and it goes back to your free will determinism. Could a good and benevolent God who's all-powerful not have done this, this, and this? I've never found a satisfactory end to that debate, and we've all had it till midnight and 3 in the morning and so on. So I ask a different question, and the question is, granted that we get a mixed picture. We have 2 cathedrals, Coventry Cathedral, Christchurch Cathedral. Coventry Cathedral and Dresden Cathedral, bombed, moral evil, if you like. Christchurch Cathedral, natural evil. But you look at those two cathedrals when you go in and you see, first of all, the bomb has hit them, but secondly, you see traces of beauty. And here I believe that we face that kind of a thing. We face a mixed picture. We see beauty. What beauty I've seen here in Australia. But look at the television. In the last few days, horrific suffering and pain. We see a mixed picture. And I ask this question, and it's granted that it's mixed. There's barbed wire and there's beauty. Is there any evidence anywhere that there is a God whom we can trust with it? And that leads me to the heart of Christianity, actually, which is the cross. And at the very least, it says to me that if that is God, he hasn't remained distant from the problem of evil, but has become part of it. Now, that's a huge, big area. But that's the way I respond. But I do stand by what I said. This is the hard question, and I have every sympathy for people that...
Okay. We're just about out of time. I meant to give people warning. There were a couple of other questions, but they really were touched on in the answer you just gave. So maybe we can finish with a question of my own, if you'll forgive me, and that is the whole idea that in belief sometimes comes excuse. That for some people a belief in God, as you've just been describing, enables them in a sense to externalise the responsibility that they have to live a good and wholesome life, that they look outside themselves for an understanding of how to live and how to be.
Are you essentially referring to the Freudian argument there?
It could be.
Yes, well,
But not only, he's not the only one who's written in those terms.
No, he's not, of course. But
and a lot of very good writers
that's the idea,
as well.
the externalization of father figure, you need something to that
to
kind of
assuage
idea.
your fear of death.
Yes, absolutely, yes. Absolutely. Okay, I'm on the same page as you are. Well, I consulted a psychiatrist on this. Because it's very interesting, because it's one of the thrusts that is in Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. That's a psychiatric term, you see, and he's referring to the Freudian argument. So I thought it'd be interesting to have a look at what some leading psychiatrists say about it. And the past president of the Royal College in London, Andrew Sims, has written a very interesting book, Is Faith a Delusion? But I think the most interesting thing I got from Manfred Lutz, who's a leading psychiatrist in Germany. You've probably come across him. And he writes this very interesting book, where he says, look, if there is no God, Freud's argument's brilliant, of saying, yes, religion is a wish fulfillment, a projection of a father figure in the sky and a desire for a crutch and so on, if there is no God. Of course, he said, if there is a God, Freud's argument equally well shows how atheism is a wish fulfillment. The desire never to have to meet God. Now I'm quoting from Czesław Miłosz, who was the Nobel Prize winner for literature in Poland. And he said, atheism is the great opiate of the people, the wish fulfillment that we'll never have to give an account. And then Manfred Lutz draws his bottom line. He said, on the question whether there's a God or not, neither Freud, Jung, nor Frankl can help you. And just a little codicil to that. Stephen Hawking was asked some time ago what he thought of religion. And he said, religion's a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. And I was asked to comment, so I did. Atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. Thank you very much.
I was about to say, please let us thank John Lennox, but you've done so in admirable fashion. Thank you very much indeed, John.
Well, thank you very much. Please congratulate our wonderful moderator.
Yes, thank you indeed, Professor Lawrence and Professor Lennox. I've found your conversation both enjoyable and stimulating. It's left me with a lot to think about. And thank you to everyone who asked a question. Apologies if your question wasn't put to Professor Lennox, but I do hope that you can continue the conversation outside this evening and in the weeks to come. A lot of work has gone into tonight, and we'd love to have your feedback on that. So can I invite you to take the programs and to turn to the middle page of those to provide some feedback on tonight's event. We'd love to hear how you found it. So up the top, you'll see some boxes. We'd love to know how it was that you heard about cosmic chemistry. And there's a number of options there. You can tick one or more than that. And if you'd like to hear more, or you'd like to hear more on this topic, then please do take the moment to put down some of your contact details so we can be in contact to give you opportunities to do that. And specifically, down towards the bottom of this feedback form, there's a few options for ways that you can continue to hear about this question and take part in discussions yourself. So the first one there is that you might have a question that you would like to discuss with someone. Please do include it on the feedback form and someone will be in contact with you. You might have had something that you loved about tonight, you'd like us to do it again. You might have a way that you can see that we can improve an event like this. So we'd love to have your feedback there. And if you're interested in reading some more of John's ideas, there are some book clubs that are planned for the coming weeks, discussing one of John's books called God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? City Bible Forum will be running discussion groups in the city, but also different organisations around Perth will be hosting them in the suburbs. So you might like to tick that box and include some of your contact details. And finally, if you'd like to know about the next time we're doing an event like this, please make sure that you indicate that on your feedback form. And finally, a couple of resources on the web. You might like to go to the City Bible Forum page to see details of courses and discussion groups that are coming up around Perth, or you might like to just see what Perth City Bible Forum is doing more generally, or please note down johnlennox.org, a great place for a number of resources, debates and dialogues and talks that John has been involved in. Well, if you're able to hang around after this, in the lobby outside, if you head to level 2, not the lobby downstairs, but the lobby that's on the same level as St George's Terrace, level 2 is where you'll find John will be there signing books. There's an opportunity to buy some books at the bookstall, or to grab a drink at the bar, or to hang around and pick up some free literature from the City Bible Forum stall. So I'll just say that again. If you'd like to see John for a book signing, then please go to level 2, which is the St George's Terrace level of this building. Well, thank you for being part of tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it and hope to see you next time.